The champagne glass trembled in my hand as Caroline held up the deed to Grandmother Eleanor's coastal cottage, her voice carrying across the Pearl Room's elegant dining area like she was announcing lottery numbers. And the best part, she laughed, waving the legal document above her head, is that Marcus and I can finally have our dream wedding venue right on the beach. The 30 guests at my 30th birthday celebration erupted in applause, but their cheers felt like daggers piercing through my chest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I sat frozen at the head table, watching my sister bask in the adoration of relatives who had gathered supposedly to celebrate me, yet were now completely captivated by her announcement. The irony wasn't lost on me that at my own birthday party, Caroline had just revealed she'd inherited the one place on earth that held my most cherished childhood memories. But what truly made my blood run cold was seeing my parents, Richard and Margaret, beaming with pride as if this moment was exactly what they'd orchestrated. "Aren't you going to congratulate your sister, Zoe?" my mother called out, her voice dripping with expectation. The entire room turned to look at me, their faces glowing with anticipation, waiting for me to play the role of the gracious older sister who would surely be thrilled by this wonderful news. I managed a tight smile and raised my glass, but my mind was racing with questions that cut deeper than any birthday wish ever could. The story of how I ended up at that table, feeling like a stranger at my own celebration, began long before that devastating evening in Portland. Growing up in the Hartwell family meant understanding an unspoken hierarchy that placed Caroline firmly at the center of our parents' universe, while I learned to navigate life from the comfortable shadows they seemed to prefer I occupy. Our childhood in the sprawling suburbs of Portland was marked by a pattern so consistent it became predictable. When Caroline struggled with mathematics in elementary school, our parents hired 3 different tutors and rearranged family schedules to ensure she received every advantage. When I tested into the gifted program that same year, the response was a casual, "That's nice, dear," over dinner, followed immediately by excitement about Caroline's upcoming dance recital. The message was clear. Caroline's challenges required family mobilization, while my achievements were simply expected and therefore unremarkable. This dynamic intensified during our teenage years, when Caroline discovered her passion for theater. Suddenly, our weekends revolved around driving her to auditions across the state, our dinner conversations centered on her latest roles, and our vacation planning accommodated her summer drama camps. Meanwhile, I had quietly developed a fascination with renewable energy technology, spending countless hours in our garage building solar panel prototypes and wind energy models that could power small devices. My projects gathered dust in the corner while Caroline's headshots lined the hallway walls. The most painful part wasn't the neglect itself, but the way our parents seemed genuinely puzzled when I expressed any disappointment. "You're so independent, Zoe," my mother would say with what she believed was a compliment. "You don't need the same level of support that Caroline does. You've always been the strong one." This reasoning became their justification for every imbalanced decision, every redirected resource, every moment when Caroline's needs overshadowed mine so completely that I began to wonder if my own dreams mattered at all. College provided my first taste of freedom from this suffocating dynamic. While Caroline chose to attend Portland State University to stay close to family, I deliberately selected Oregon State University in Corvallis, claiming I wanted to study their renowned engineering program. The truth was more complex. I needed physical distance to discover who I could become without constantly being measured against my sister's more visible struggles and achievements. During my sophomore year, something remarkable happened that would change the trajectory of my life, though at the time it felt like just another family gathering. Grandmother Eleanor, my father's mother, had invited me to spend a weekend at her cottage in Cannon Beach. Unlike the rest of the family, Grandma Eleanor had always paid attention to my quieter interests, asking detailed questions about my engineering projects, and listening intently to my theories about sustainable energy solutions. That particular weekend, as we walked along the rocky shoreline with salt spray misting our faces, she asked me about my long-term goals. I found myself sharing dreams I'd never voiced to anyone else. My vision of developing affordable solar technology for rural communities, my plans to create energy independence for areas affected by natural disasters, my hope of building a company that could make a real environmental impact. Instead of the polite but distant responses I'd grown accustomed to at home, Grandma Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face me with an intensity I'd never seen before. "Zoe," she said, gripping my hands with surprising strength, "you have your great-grandfather's mind for innovation. He built this family's first real estate investments from nothing but determination and smart thinking. I see that same spark in you, but I also see something he didn't have: compassion for the bigger picture." She paused, looking out at the endless Pacific horizon. "Promise me something. No matter what happens with this family, no matter how they make you feel, don't let them dim that spark. The world needs what you're thinking about, even if they can't see it yet." I promised, though I didn't fully understand why the conversation felt so weighted with importance. Grandma Eleanor seemed to be saying goodbye to more than just our weekend together, and her words carried an urgency that stayed with me long after I returned to my dorm room. Over the following months, she began calling me directly rather than going through my parents, asking about my classes, my projects, and my evolving business ideas, with a curiosity that felt like oxygen after years of holding my breath. When Grandma Eleanor passed away during my senior year, the loss hit me harder than I'd expected. She had been the one family member who truly saw me as an individual, rather than Caroline's older sister or Richard and Margaret's low-maintenance daughter. At her funeral, I delivered a eulogy about her love of the ocean and her talent for making everyone feel heard, but I kept private the deeper conversations we'd shared about dreams and determination. The reading of her will took place 2 weeks later in Victoria Ross's law office downtown. I assumed I might receive some small keepsake, perhaps one of her vintage brooches or a piece of furniture from the cottage that held sentimental value. Caroline had always been vocal about wanting the beachside property, describing elaborate plans for renovating it into a wedding venue or vacation rental that could generate income for her future family. Victoria Ross, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had handled Grandmother Eleanor's legal affairs for decades, gathered our family in her conference room with an atmosphere of formal solemnity. She began reading the will in the traditional legal language that made every bequest sound both official and emotionally distant. Caroline received Grandmother's jewelry collection, a substantial sum that would cover her remaining college expenses, and several pieces of antique furniture. My parents inherited various financial investments and family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. Then Victoria Ross paused, looking directly at me before continuing. "To my granddaughter Zoe Hartwell, who possesses the vision and determination to honor both innovation and responsibility, I leave my cottage at Cannon Beach, along with all its contents, the surrounding 2 acres of oceanfront property, and the establishment of the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation, with an initial endowment of $2.3 million, designated specifically to support sustainable energy research and implementation in underserved communities." The silence in that conference room was so complete, I could hear the heating system cycling on in the background. Carolyn's face went through a rapid progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a hurt so profound it made her look years younger. My parents sat completely motionless, as if moving might somehow change what they'd just heard. I felt like I was experiencing the moment from outside my own body, watching this impossible scene unfold, while some other version of myself tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "There must be some mistake," my mother finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Eleanor always talked about Caroline having the cottage. She loved that property." Victoria Ross consulted her documents with professional precision. Mrs. Hartwell updated her will 18 months ago. These were her final wishes, confirmed through multiple conversations and documented thoroughly. She was very specific about her reasoning and very clear about her intentions. She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandmother Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. She asked me to give this to Zoe privately. The drive home from the lawyer's office was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Caroline cried silently in the passenger seat, while my parents maintained a stunned quiet that felt more ominous than any argument would have. When we finally reached the house, Caroline immediately disappeared into her room, and I could hear her calling friends to share the devastating news that her plans for the cottage had been completely upended. I retreated to my childhood bedroom to read Grandmother Eleanor's letter in private. Her words explained everything and nothing all at once. She wrote about watching me grow up in the shadow of a family that loved me but didn't understand me, about recognizing my potential during our weekend conversations, and about her belief that I would use the inheritance to create something meaningful rather than simply enjoying the property as a personal retreat. The cottage represents possibility, Zoe. She had written, not just the possibility of owning something beautiful, but the possibility of using that gift as a foundation for the work you're meant to do in this world. The foundation money isn't meant to make you wealthy. It's meant to make your dreams achievable. I trust you to honor both the gift and the responsibility it represents. The letter continued with specific instructions about accessing various accounts and safety deposit boxes, along with contact information for financial advisors and foundation management specialists she had already retained. Reading her words, I realized this inheritance wasn't a surprise decision. It was the result of careful planning and deep consideration of each family member's character and capabilities. But the immediate impact wasn't the financial windfall or even the property ownership. It was the way this inheritance exposed the fault lines that had always existed in our family relationships. Over the following weeks, as the reality settled in, my parents began treating me with a mixture of resentment.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And newfound respect that felt more uncomfortable than their previous indifference. They would ask pointed questions about my plans for the cottage, suggesting ways Caroline might still be involved in its use, while simultaneously acknowledging my decision-making authority in a way they never had before. Caroline's response was more direct and infinitely more painful. She accused me of manipulating Grandmother Eleanor during her final years, of pretending to share interests I didn't really have, of systematically undermining her own relationship with our grandmother to secure the inheritance. These accusations hurt, not because they were true, but because they revealed how little Caroline actually knew about my genuine conversations with Grandma Eleanor, or my authentic passion for sustainable energy work. The worst part was that I understood Caroline's pain, even as her accusations cut deep. She had lost something she'd counted on, something that represented security and future possibilities in her mind. But her inability to consider that I might have deserved this inheritance based on my own merits rather than manipulation revealed a fundamental disconnect in how she viewed my worth as a person. As my college graduation approached, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of moving back to Portland and trying to navigate the new family dynamics while launching my career, I used a small portion of the foundation money to relocate to Seattle. There, I connected with Daniel Chen, a brilliant software engineer who shared my passion for renewable energy applications. Together, we launched Hartwell Sustainable Solutions, a startup focused on developing affordable solar and wind technology for communities that had been overlooked by larger energy companies. The business grew slowly but steadily, fueled by foundation grants and my obsessive attention to both technological innovation and community impact. We started by installing solar panels in rural Oregon towns affected by recent wildfires, then expanded to provide backup energy systems for schools in economically disadvantaged areas. Each project validated Grandmother Eleanor's belief that I would use her gift to create something larger than personal success. For 2 years, I maintained minimal contact with my family, sharing updates about my work only when directly asked, and avoiding discussions about the cottage, which remained largely unused except for occasional weekend retreats when I needed to recharge. Caroline had moved in with her boyfriend Marcus and seemed to be building a successful career in marketing, though our conversations rarely went deeper than surface-level pleasantries during family phone calls. My parents adapted to this new distance by treating me like a successful but somewhat mysterious relative who had chosen an unconventional path. They would mention my company's achievements to their friends with a mixture of pride and bewilderment, as if they couldn't quite believe their quiet older daughter had become an entrepreneur. This response was better than resentment, but it also confirmed my suspicion that they had never really known me well enough to be surprised by my capabilities. Everything changed when Caroline called me 6 weeks before my 30th birthday, her voice bubbling with excitement about her engagement to Marcus and their plans for a destination wedding that would showcase their love story to friends and family. As she described their vision for an oceanside ceremony, I could hear the assumption in her voice that I would naturally offer the cottage as their venue, that this call was just a formality before making their announcement official. "Zoe, "You know how much that place means to our family," she said, her tone carrying the same persuasive quality that had always helped her get what she wanted from our parents. "Marcus and I have been dreaming about exchanging vows where Grandma Eleanor used to walk on the beach. It would be like having her there with us, blessing our marriage." I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same sensation I'd experienced countless times during our childhood, when Caroline's needs were presented as family obligations that I was expected to support without question. But this time, something was different. I had spent 2 years building confidence in my own judgment, learning to trust my instincts about people and situations, developing the kind of backbone that only comes from making independent decisions with real consequences. "Caroline," I said carefully, "I understand this is important to you, but the cottage isn't just a family property anymore. It's my home, and it's also connected to my foundation work. I've been planning to use it for hosting retreats for young women interested in STEM careers." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When Caroline finally responded, her voice had completely changed. "Are you seriously telling me you won't let your own sister use that cottage for her wedding? After everything our family has been through? After how much Grandma Eleanor loved both of us?" The conversation deteriorated from there, with Caroline accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful while I tried to explain the difference between occasional family use and hosting a large wedding that would require extensive preparations and potentially damage the property. By the time we hung up, it was clear that this disagreement had exposed deeper conflicts about family loyalty, inheritance rights, and the expectations that still governed our relationship. Over the following weeks, my parents became involved in what they diplomatically called, quote, "helping Caroline and Zoe find a compromise." Their version of help consisted of lengthy phone calls explaining why I should reconsider my position, followed by detailed descriptions of Caroline's disappointment and stress as her original wedding plans fell apart. The message was unmistakable. I was being unreasonable, and the family expected me to prioritize Caroline's happiness over my own attachment to the property. These conversations brought back every childhood feeling of being the responsible one who was expected to sacrifice for Caroline's benefit. But now I had the financial independence and emotional distance to recognize the manipulation for what it was. I also had Daniel, whose outside perspective helped me see how abnormal these family dynamics really were. "Zoe," he said one evening as I vented about another guilt-inducing call from my mother. "Normal families don't operate like this. Siblings don't automatically inherit claims on each other's property, especially when that property was specifically left to one person. The fact that your parents are pressuring you to ignore your grandmother's wishes says more about them than it does about you." His words gave me clarity I hadn't been able to achieve on my own. I called Caroline back and offered what I thought was a generous compromise. She could use the cottage for her wedding ceremony, but I would need to oversee all preparations to ensure the property wasn't damaged, and she would need to cover all costs, including security deposits for potential repairs. I thought this solution honored both her desires and my responsibilities as the property owner. Caroline's response shattered any remaining hope for a peaceful resolution. "You want me to pay to use my own grandmother's cottage for my wedding? You're treating me like a stranger instead of your sister. This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior that proves you manipulated Grandma Eleanor into changing her will. A real family member would be honored to host such an important celebration." That accusation that I had manipulated our dying grandmother crossed a line I hadn't realized existed until she stepped over it. I hung up the phone and made a decision that would define the next phase of my relationship with my entire family. I would attend my birthday celebration as planned. I would be polite and gracious. But I would no longer apologize for inheriting something that was rightfully mine, or for using that inheritance according to my own values and judgment. What I didn't anticipate was how my family would use my birthday party as their final opportunity to pressure me into submission, or how they would orchestrate the evening to maximize my public humiliation, while celebrating Caroline's persistence in pursuing what she believed was rightfully hers. As I sat in the Pearl Room that evening, watching 30 relatives applaud my sister's announcement about the cottage deed, I realized I was witnessing something far more calculated than a simple family celebration gone wrong. The weeks leading up to my 30th birthday had been filled with cryptic phone calls between my parents and various relatives, hushed conversations that would stop abruptly whenever I entered the room during my brief visits home. My mother had insisted on planning an elaborate celebration at the Pearl Room, Portland's most prestigious restaurant, claiming that turning 30 deserved special recognition. At the time, I had been touched by their sudden attention to my milestone, interpreting it as a sign that our family relationships might be healing after the tension surrounding the cottage inheritance. Daniel had offered to accompany me to the celebration, but I had declined, thinking this would be an opportunity to reconnect with extended family members I rarely saw, and perhaps find some common ground with Carolyn and my parents. The restaurant choice should have been my first warning sign. The Pearl Room was far more expensive than any venue my family had ever chosen for my previous birthdays, and the guest list included cousins, aunts, and uncles who typically only gathered for weddings or funerals. As I dressed for the evening in my downtown Seattle apartment, I had felt optimistic about the possibility of moving past our recent conflicts. My business was thriving, with 3 new contracts signed that month for renewable energy installations in rural communities across the Pacific Northwest. The foundation work was exceeding all expectations, providing educational scholarships for young women pursuing engineering degrees and funding innovative research projects at universities throughout Oregon and Washington. For the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely proud of my accomplishments and confident in my ability to navigate family dynamics from a position of strength rather than defensive uncertainty. The Pearl Room's elegant atmosphere initially seemed perfect for a birthday celebration. Soft lighting reflected off crystal glasses, and the panoramic view of the Willamette River created a sophisticated backdrop that made everyone look more glamorous than usual. My relatives had greeted me with warm hugs and genuine interest in my work, asking detailed questions about sustainable energy and expressing admiration for my entrepreneurial success. Uncle Robert, my father's brother, had even mentioned considering solar panels for his own business after hearing about the cost savings my clients were experiencing. Caroline had arrived fashionably late with Marcus, both of them dressed impeccably and carrying themselves with the confidence of a couple who had exciting news to share. She had embraced me with what seemed like genuine affection, complimenting my dress and expressing enthusiasm about celebrating together as a family. Marcus had been equally charming, engaging me in conversation about the challenges of starting a business and showing what appeared to be authentic interest in my company's mission. The dinner conversation flowed smoothly through multiple courses, with relatives sharing updates about their children's achievements, travel adventures, and professional milestones. I found myself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of family gatherings, remembering why I had once enjoyed these occasions before the inheritance complications had strained our relationships. My parents seemed more attentive than usual, asking thoughtful questions about my work and expressing pride in my accomplishments in front of the extended family. It was during dessert that the evening's true purpose began to reveal itself. My father stood up with his champagne glass, commanding attention from the entire table with the authoritative presence he typically reserved for important business presentations. "We're gathered tonight not just to celebrate Zoe's 30th birthday," he began, his voice carrying across the dining room, "but also to share in some wonderful family news that brings everything full circle." He gestured toward Caroline and Marcus, who both stood up with smiles that seemed too practiced to be spontaneous. Caroline was holding a manila envelope that she had apparently brought specifically for this moment, though I couldn't remember seeing it earlier in the evening. The anticipation in the room was palpable, with relatives leaning forward in their chairs and phones appearing in hands ready to capture whatever announcement was coming. "As many of you know," my father continued, "our family has been blessed with the beautiful property in Cannon Beach that belonged to Zoe's grandmother Eleanor. Caroline and Marcus have been working tirelessly to plan their dream wedding, and we're thrilled to announce that they've secured the perfect venue for their celebration." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I still didn't understand exactly what was happening. Caroline opened the envelope with theatrical flair, pulling out what appeared to be legal documents that she held up for everyone to see. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with a joy that seemed both genuine and performative, "Marcus and I are getting married at Grandmother Eleanor's cottage this summer." The applause was thunderous, with relatives jumping up from their seats to congratulate the happy couple and express excitement about attending a wedding in such a picturesque location. Several people immediately began discussing travel arrangements and accommodation options, treating the announcement as a settled fact that required only logistical planning. I sat frozen in my chair, trying to process how this moment had come to pass, and what those documents in Caroline's hands actually represented. My mother appeared beside my chair, placing her hand on my shoulder with what felt like a mixture of affection and warning. Isn't this wonderful, Zoe? Caroline and Marcus have worked so hard to make this happen, and they've handled all the legal arrangements so you don't have to worry about any of the details. The phrase legal arrangements sent ice through my veins. I looked more closely at the documents Carolyn was now passing around the table for relatives to admire. Even from my position several seats away, I could see official letterheads and what appeared to be property documentation. The realization hit me with devastating clarity. Somehow, Caroline had obtained legal claim to the cottage, and this birthday celebration was actually her announcement party disguised as my milestone event. How? I managed to whisper to my mother, my voice barely audible above the continuing congratulations and excited chatter. How is this possible? My mother's expression shifted to what she probably thought was maternal compassion, but looked more like pity, mixed with exasperation. Sweetheart, you've been so busy with your company, and living so far away. Caroline has been handling the property maintenance and tax obligations for the cottage, while you've been focused on other things. The legal transfer was just a formality to recognize her investment and ongoing care for the property. The explanation made no sense because I had been meticulously managing all aspects of the cottage ownership through remote property management services and automated tax payments. Caroline had never been involved in any maintenance decisions, nor had she been given access to make such arrangements. But as I looked around the table at relatives who were now discussing wedding favors and ceremony logistics, I realized that the specific details mattered less than the public presentation of this transfer as an accomplished fact. Marcus appeared at my other side, his demeanor friendly but somehow patronizing as he leaned down to speak directly into my ear. Zoe, I hope you understand how much this means to Caroline. She's been dreaming about this wedding location since we got engaged, and your parents helped us realize that keeping the cottage in active family use honors your grandmother's memory better than letting it sit empty most of the year. His words contained multiple implications that made my head spin. First, the suggestion that I had been neglecting the property, which was completely false. Second, the idea that my parents had somehow facilitated this transfer, which meant they had been planning this outcome while maintaining the pretense of supporting my ownership rights. Third, the assumption that I would naturally agree with their interpretation of how to honor Grandmother Eleanor's memory, despite the fact that she had specifically chosen to leave the property to me rather than to the family collectively. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to use the restroom, but actually desperate for a moment alone to think clearly about what was happening and what options I might have. The restaurant's bathroom was mercifully empty, allowing me to splash cold water on my face and try to organize my thoughts. The legal documents Caroline had displayed could represent anything from actual property deeds to preliminary wedding venue contracts, but I wouldn't know the truth until I could examine them closely or contact Victoria Ross to verify the status of my ownership. When I returned to the table, Caroline was in the middle of describing her vision for the wedding ceremony, complete with detailed plans for decorating the cottage interior and arranging seating on the beach. She spoke with the authority of someone who had been planning these details for months, referencing specific vendors she had already contacted and permits she had researched for hosting events on the property. The level of preparation suggested this announcement had been long in the making, rather than a recent development she was sharing with family. My cousin Jennifer, whom I had always considered one of the more thoughtful relatives, raised a question that I had been afraid to ask myself. Caroline, this sounds absolutely magical, but I'm curious about the logistics. Zoe, you'll be helping coordinate everything since it's your property, right? The table fell silent for the first time all evening, with everyone turning to look at me expectantly. Caroline's smile remained fixed, but I caught a flicker of something harder in her eyes as she waited for my response. My parents both leaned slightly forward, their posture suggesting they were prepared to intervene if I said anything that might disrupt the celebratory atmosphere they had worked to create. Actually, I said carefully, choosing my words with the precision I had learned from years of business negotiations, I think there might be some confusion about the current ownership status of the cottage. I'd need to review any legal documents before confirming arrangements for such a significant event. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, as relatives exchanged glances that conveyed both surprise and discomfort. Caroline's smile finally faltered, replaced by an expression of hurt that looked genuine but also strategic. Zoe, I thought we had moved past this kind of territorial behavior. This is about family, not property rights. My father cleared his throat with the authoritative sound that had always signaled he was about to settle a family dispute with executive decision-making. Girls, let's not turn this beautiful evening into a business discussion. Caroline has been wonderful about taking care of the cottage arrangements, and I'm sure we can work out any administrative details later. But Marcus, perhaps emboldened by champagne or confident in whatever legal groundwork they had established, decided to press the issue further. Zoe, I think you'll find that Caroline's claim to the property is more solid than you might expect. Your grandmother's will contained some ambiguous language about family stewardship that creates shared ownership rights under certain circumstances. His statement was so legally specific that it couldn't have been casual speculation. Someone had clearly consulted with attorneys about challenging my inheritance, and this birthday celebration was the public unveiling of whatever strategy they had developed. The realization that my own family had been plotting against my legal rights while maintaining friendly contact with me was more devastating than losing the property itself would have been. I stood up from the table with as much dignity as I could manage, knowing that anything I said in this public setting would be remembered and potentially used against me in whatever legal proceedings were apparently already underway. Quote, "This has been a lovely celebration," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil I felt inside. "Carolyn, I wish you and Marcus every happiness in your wedding planning. I'll need to review the documents you mentioned and consult with my own legal counsel before we discuss venue arrangements further." The diplomatic language didn't fool anyone present, but it allowed me to exit the situation without creating the kind of dramatic scene that would have given them additional ammunition for portraying me as unstable or vindictive. Several relatives offered polite goodbyes and birthday wishes as I gathered my purse and coat, but the warmth that had characterized the earlier part of the evening had evaporated completely. Caroline followed me toward the restaurant exit, catching up with me near the coat check area where we could speak with relative privacy. "Zoe, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. You have your successful business and your foundation work. The cottage would just be a vacation home for you, but it represents everything Marcus and I have dreamed about for starting our married life together." Her appeal was emotionally manipulative in exactly the way that had always worked when we were children, but I was no longer the insecure young person who had absorbed guilt about taking up too much space in the family dynamic. "Caroline, if you believe you have legal rights to the cottage, then we'll resolve this through proper legal channels. But ambushing me at my own birthday party with a public announcement about property I inherited specifically and individually was inappropriate, regardless of whatever claims you think you might have." She stepped back as if I had physically pushed her, her eyes filling with tears that might have been genuine or performative. "I can't believe you're choosing property over family. Grandmother Eleanor would be heartbroken to see us fighting like this over something she intended to bring joy to all of us." The invocation of our grandmother's wishes was particularly galling, because Caroline had never had the kind of relationship with Grandmother Eleanor that would have given her insight into those wishes. But arguing about the past wouldn't change the present situation, and I was increasingly aware that every word of this conversation would likely be reported back to my parents and potentially to whatever lawyers they had consulted. I left the Pearl Room that evening with the devastating knowledge that my family had used my birthday celebration as their platform for publicly claiming ownership of my inheritance. The drive back to my hotel through Portland's quiet downtown streets gave me time to process the full scope of what had just occurred and begin planning my response to what was clearly a coordinated attack on my legal rights and personal autonomy. The next morning, I called Victoria Ross from my hotel room, requesting an emergency consultation about the status of Grandmother Eleanor's estate and any recent legal challenges to my ownership of the cottage. Her assistant scheduled an appointment for that afternoon, and her tone suggested that she was already aware of developments I hadn't yet been formally notified about. Victoria's office felt like a sanctuary of professional competence after the emotional manipulation I had experienced the previous evening. She reviewed my concerns with the thorough attention to detail that had made her Grandmother Eleanor's trusted advisor for decades. After consulting several files and making notes on a legal pad, she looked up at me with an expression that combined reassurance with concern. "Zoe, your ownership of the cottage and foundation assets is absolutely secure. Your grandmother's will was expertly drafted and has been properly executed through probate court. However, your family has recently consulted with another attorney about challenging certain aspects of the inheritance based on claims about your grandmother's mental capacity at the time she updated her will. The accusation that Grandmother Eleanor had been mentally incompetent when she chose to leave me the cottage was so offensive that I struggled to maintain my composure. Anyone who had spent time with her during her final years would have recognized her sharp intelligence and clear decision-making abilities. The suggestion that she had been manipulated or confused when she made her inheritance decisions was not only false but deeply disrespectful to her memory. Victoria continued with the calm professionalism that made her such an effective advocate. These challenges rarely succeed when the will was properly witnessed and executed, which your grandmother's certainly was. However, they can create delays and expenses that some people use as leverage for negotiating settlements outside of court. I suspect your family's attorney has advised them that while they're unlikely to win a direct challenge, they might pressure you into sharing the inheritance to avoid legal costs and publicity. Her assessment confirmed my suspicion that the previous evening's announcement had been strategic rather than celebratory. Caroline and my parents had probably been advised that their legal position was weak, but that they could use the threat of prolonged litigation and family conflict to pressure me into giving them what they wanted voluntarily. The birthday party ambush had been designed to make me look selfish and unreasonable for refusing to share property that they would claim publicly should belong to the entire family. I left Victoria's office with a clear understanding of my legal rights and a detailed strategy for protecting them, but also with the heartbreaking realization that my relationship with my family had been irreparably damaged by their willingness to pursue these tactics. The people who were supposed to support and protect me had instead chosen to attack my inheritance, question my integrity, and manipulate my emotions in pursuit of assets that legally and morally belonged to me. The drive back to Seattle that afternoon gave me hours to think about how I wanted to respond to this situation and what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to maintain with family members who had proven themselves capable of such calculated betrayal. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made decisions that would define the next chapter of my life and honor the trust Grandmother Eleanor had placed in me when she chose to leave me her most precious possessions. The silence that followed my return to Seattle was deafening in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in my adult life, my phone wasn't buzzing with family updates, casual check-ins, or invitations to various gatherings and celebrations. The absence of contact that I had initially welcomed as a relief from emotional manipulation gradually transformed into something more complex and troubling. I found myself checking my phone compulsively, simultaneously hoping for and dreading messages that never came. Daniel noticed the change in my demeanor within days of my return from Portland. While I had shared the basic facts about the birthday party confrontation, I hadn't fully conveyed the depth of betrayal I felt, or the extent to which the incident had shaken my understanding of family loyalty. He approached the subject with the careful sensitivity he brought to all our personal conversations, waiting for me to be ready to discuss the emotional impact rather than pushing for details I wasn't prepared to share. "You've been carrying something heavy since Portland," he observed one evening as we worked late in our shared office space, the city lights of downtown Seattle creating a backdrop of distant activity beyond our windows. "I know the legal situation is settled, but this feels like more than property disputes." His perception was accurate in ways that surprised me. The cottage and foundation inheritance represented security and opportunity, but the family dynamics that had been exposed during the birthday party challenge went much deeper than financial concerns. I was grappling with the realization that people I had loved and trusted throughout my life had been willing to manipulate, deceive, and publicly humiliate me in pursuit of assets they believed they deserved more than I did. "It's the assumption that I don't deserve what I inherited," I finally said, voicing thoughts that had been circling in my mind for weeks. Not just Caroline, but my parents, relatives who barely know me, people who have watched me work toward my goals for years but still believe I must have somehow cheated or manipulated my way into Grandmother Eleanor's favor. Daniel set aside the technical specifications he had been reviewing and gave me his full attention with the focused presence that made him such an effective business partner and trusted friend. "That says everything about their character, and nothing about yours. People who truly know you would never question whether you earned recognition based on your own merits." His confidence in my integrity provided comfort, but it also highlighted the isolation I was experiencing from the family relationships that had once provided emotional anchoring, however imperfect they might have been. I was learning to navigate adult life without the safety net of family support, discovering strengths I hadn't known I possessed while simultaneously mourning the loss of connections I had always taken for granted. The business demands of Hartwell Sustainable Solutions provided welcome distraction from personal turmoil during those initial weeks of family estrangement. We had received inquiries about expanding our services to communities in Northern California that had been affected by recent wildfire damage, and the project scope required extensive research and planning that consumed most of my waking hours. The work felt particularly meaningful because it aligned perfectly with the Foundation's mission of providing sustainable energy solutions to underserved areas. Our team had grown to include 6 full-time employees and several contracted specialists who brought expertise in everything from electrical engineering to community outreach. The expansion meant moving to larger office space in Seattle's technology corridor, a transition that symbolized both professional success and personal independence from the family connections that had once seemed essential to my identity. During this period of intense focus on business growth, I received an unexpected phone call from Victoria Ross, requesting a meeting that she described as urgent but wouldn't elaborate about over the phone. The cryptic nature of her request immediately triggered anxiety about potential legal complications, though she assured me that my inheritance remained secure, and there had been no new challenges to the estate settlement. Her downtown Portland office provided the same atmosphere of professional competence that had been so reassuring during our previous consultation, but Victoria's demeanor carried an undertone of excitement that seemed unusual for someone typically so measured in her emotional expressions. She had arranged several documents on her conference table and gestured for me to take a seat across from her with the formality that accompanied important legal discussions. "Zoe, I've been contacted by representatives of your family regarding a proposed settlement agreement that they believe might resolve the ongoing tensions about your inheritance." She paused, studying my reaction carefully before continuing. "They've offered to withdraw any potential legal challenges in exchange for your agreement to share access to the cottage property and contribute a portion of the foundation funds toward Caroline's wedding expenses." The proposal was so audacious that I initially thought I had misunderstood the terms. My family was offering to stop challenging inheritance that was already legally mine, in exchange for my voluntary surrender of significant portions of that same inheritance. The logic was circular and the entitlement breathtaking, but the fact that they had formalized this proposal through legal channels suggested they genuinely believed it represented a reasonable compromise. "What exactly are they requesting in specific terms?" I asked, needing to understand the full scope of their expectations before formulating my response. Victoria consulted her notes with the precision that made her such an effective advocate. "Joint custody of the cottage property with rotating access schedules, establishment of a family trust that would give Caroline and your parents voting rights over foundation expenditures, and an immediate payment of $200,000 from foundation assets to cover wedding costs that they characterize as honoring your grandmother's memory through family celebration." Each element of the proposal represented a fundamental violation of Grandmother Eleanor's clearly stated intentions when she had chosen to leave the inheritance specifically to me rather than to the family collectively. The cottage was meant to be my retreat and foundation headquarters, not a shared vacation property subject to committee decisions. The foundation was designed to support my vision for sustainable energy development, not to fund family events regardless of how they might be justified as memorial activities. "There's more," Victoria continued, her expression indicating that she had saved the most problematic element for last. "They're requesting that you relocate your primary residence back to Portland to be available for family responsibilities and foundation oversight. The proposal suggests that your current distance from Oregon makes it difficult for you to properly steward assets that have significant meaning for multiple family members. The demand that I restructure my entire life to accommodate their vision of appropriate inheritance management was so presumptuous that it clarified something important about how they viewed my autonomy and decision-making capacity. They genuinely believed they had the right to dictate where I lived, how I spent foundation money, and when I could access property that belonged entirely to me. The settlement proposal wasn't an attempt at compromise. It was a formalized expression of their conviction that I should be supervised and controlled by family members who considered themselves more qualified to manage Grandmother Eleanor's legacy. "I assume they've given you some timeline for responding to this generous offer," I said, allowing sarcasm to creep into my voice for the first time during our professional interactions. Victoria smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had anticipated my reaction and prepared accordingly. "They've requested a response within 30 days, and they've indicated that failure to accept these terms will result in immediate legal action challenging both your inheritance and your mental capacity to manage foundation assets responsibly. The threat to question my mental competence was particularly offensive because it echoed the same tactics they had proposed using against Grandmother Eleanor's decision-making abilities. The pattern revealed a family dynamic where anyone who made choices that inconvenienced Caroline or my parents could expect to have their judgment questioned, rather than their preferences respected. "Victoria, I need you to prepare a response that makes my position absolutely clear," I said, feeling a clarity of purpose that had been building throughout our conversation. "I will not be sharing ownership of property that was left specifically to me. I will not be surrendering control of foundation assets to people who don't understand or support its mission. And I will not be relocating my life to accommodate family members who have demonstrated complete disregard for my autonomy and judgment." She nodded with approval that suggested she had been hoping for exactly this kind of decisive response. "I'll draft a formal rejection that protects your legal position while leaving no ambiguity about your intentions. Should they follow through on their threat to initiate legal proceedings, we'll be well prepared to defend against any challenges." The meeting concluded with specific plans for documenting my proper stewardship of both the cottage and foundation assets, creating an evidentiary record that would demonstrate my responsible management and clear decision-making abilities. Victoria's confidence in our legal position provided reassurance, but I left her office knowing that the battle for my independence was far from over. The drive back to Seattle that afternoon gave me time to process the full implications of my family's settlement proposal and formulate a personal response that went beyond legal technicalities. Their offer had revealed the depth of their entitlement and the extent to which they were willing to violate both legal boundaries and emotional trust to obtain what they wanted. But it had also forced me to articulate my own values and priorities, with a clarity that had been missing during the confusion and hurt of the previous months. Over the following week, I found myself examining every aspect of my relationship with family members who had participated in or supported the settlement proposal. The emotional manipulation, public humiliation, and legal threats weren't isolated incidents, but rather expressions of a fundamental worldview that positioned Caroline's wants as family obligations and my resistance as selfish dysfunction. Understanding this pattern helped me recognize that no amount of compromise or accommodation would ever be sufficient to satisfy people who genuinely believed they were entitled to control my life decisions. The realization was simultaneously liberating and heartbreaking. I could finally stop trying to find middle ground with people who viewed any boundary I established as unreasonable selfishness. But I also had to accept that the family relationships I had once cherished were based on dynamics that required me to subordinate my own needs and judgment to their collective comfort and convenience. Daniel became an invaluable source of perspective during this period of emotional processing and decision-making. His own family background provided a stark contrast to the dysfunction I was navigating, but he avoided making comparisons that might minimize my experience or suggest simple solutions to complex relationship challenges. Instead, he listened with the patient attention that allowed me to work through my own thoughts and feelings without pressure to reach conclusions before I was ready. The hardest part is accepting that people you love can be fundamentally wrong about who you are and what you deserve, I confided during one of our evening conversations in the office break room. I keep wanting to find ways to help them understand my perspective, but they're not interested in understanding. They're interested in compliance. His response reflected the careful thought he brought to all our important discussions. Some people can only maintain relationships with others who agree to be smaller than they actually are. When you refuse to shrink yourself to fit their comfort level, they interpret that as betrayal rather than growth. His insight helped me understand why my professional success and financial independence had seemed to create more family tension rather than pride or celebration. My achievements highlighted the gap between their limited expectations for my life and the reality of what I had actually accomplished. Rather than adjusting their perceptions to accommodate new information about my capabilities, they had chosen to interpret my success as evidence that I had somehow cheated or manipulated my way into opportunities I didn't deserve. The 30-day deadline for responding to the settlement proposal provided a natural timeline for making final decisions about how I wanted to handle ongoing family relationships. I spent considerable time reviewing Grandmother Eleanor's letters and documents, searching for guidance about how she had envisioned me using the inheritance she had entrusted to my care. Her words consistently emphasized independence, innovation, and using resources to create positive change rather than simply maintaining family harmony. One letter in particular provided clarity about her intentions and expectations. She had written about watching me grow up in a family that loved me but didn't understand me, and her hope that the inheritance would give me the freedom to pursue my vision without being constrained by other people's limitations or expectations. The cottage and foundation are meant to support your dreams, not to create obligations that prevent you from achieving them, she had written in her distinctive handwriting. Reading her words during this period of family conflict felt like receiving guidance directly from someone who had understood both my potential and the challenges I would face in claiming space for my own priorities. Grandmother Eleanor had anticipated that her decision to leave the inheritance specifically to me might create family tension, but she had trusted me to handle that pressure with integrity while remaining committed to my own growth and goals. Armed with this clarity about her intentions and my own values, I contacted Victoria Ross to finalize my response to the settlement proposal. The formal rejection would establish legal boundaries that protected my inheritance rights, but I also wanted to send a personal message that addressed the emotional manipulation my family had attempted to use against me. The letter I composed was direct without being hostile, firm without being vindictive. I explained that I would continue honoring Grandmother Eleanor's trust by using the cottage and foundation assets according to her clearly stated intentions. I offered to maintain cordial relationships with family members who could respect my decisions and boundaries, but I would not be participating in further negotiations about sharing inheritance that belonged entirely to me. Most importantly, I made clear that any future contact would need to be based on genuine respect for my autonomy rather than attempts to pressure me into compliance with their preferences. The letter represented my final attempt to establish healthy relationships with people who had demonstrated their willingness to prioritize their wants over my well-being, but it also served as documentation of my reasonable efforts to resolve conflicts through direct communication. Sending that letter felt like closing one chapter of my life and opening another. For the first time since Grandmother Eleanor's death, I had complete clarity about my priorities and the kind of relationships I wanted to maintain going forward. The family connections that had once seemed essential to my identity would either evolve to accommodate my growth and independence, or they would become part of my past rather than my future. 3 months after sending my formal rejection of the settlement proposal, I received a call that would change everything about how I understood my family's true motivations and capabilities. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Chen, a financial investigator with the Oregon State Attorney General's office, and she was requesting an urgent meeting about irregularities discovered in connection with recent legal filings related to my inheritance case. My initial assumption was that my family had escalated their legal challenges and somehow involved state authorities in their attempts to question my mental capacity or inheritance rights. The prospect of government investigation into my personal affairs was terrifying, particularly since I had worked so carefully to maintain proper documentation and legal compliance for all foundation activities and property management decisions. Rebecca Chen's voice carried the professional gravity that government officials use when discussing serious legal matters, but there was also an undertone of something I couldn't quite identify. Ms. Hartwell, I want to assure you that you're not under investigation or suspected of any wrongdoing. However, some information has come to light that we believe you need to be aware of, and we may need your cooperation in addressing certain fraudulent activities that appear to involve members of your family. The word fraudulent hit me like a physical blow, even though I had no idea what specific activities she might be referencing. My mind immediately went to the legal challenges my family had threatened, wondering if they had somehow falsified documents or made false claims to authorities in their efforts to challenge my inheritance. The possibility that people I had loved and trusted might have committed actual crimes in pursuit of assets they wanted was almost too devastating to contemplate. We arranged to meet the following day at the Federal Building in downtown Portland, a location that underscored the seriousness of whatever information she needed to share. The drive from Seattle gave me hours to imagine worst-case scenarios and attempt to prepare myself for revelations that might fundamentally alter my understanding of recent events and family relationships. Rebecca Chen's office reflected the utilitarian efficiency of government workspaces, with filing cabinets lining the walls and documents organized in precise stacks across her desk. She was a woman in her 40s with the sharp attention to detail that effective investigators develop through years of examining complex financial records and legal documents. Her demeanor was simultaneously reassuring and concerning as she gestured for me to take a seat across from her desk. "Ms. Hartwell, what I'm about to share with you is part of an ongoing investigation, so I need your commitment to confidentiality while we gather additional evidence and build our case." She paused, studying my expression carefully before continuing. "We've discovered that your sister Caroline and your parents have been involved in a sophisticated scheme to fraudulently claim ownership of your inherited property and foundation assets." The word sophisticated suggested something far more elaborate than the legal challenges and emotional manipulation I had already experienced. I braced myself for details that would reveal new depths of betrayal and deception, though I couldn't imagine what additional tactics they might have employed beyond the settlement proposals and threats I was already aware of. Rebecca opened a thick file folder and began extracting documents that I recognized as official-looking forms and legal paperwork. "Your family has been working with a disbarred attorney named Thomas Brennan, who specializes in helping people fraudulently claim inheritance rights through forged documents and false testimony. They've created an elaborate paper trail suggesting that your grandmother was mentally incompetent when she updated her will, and they've attempted to establish Caroline as the rightful heir through fabricated medical records and witness statements." The scope of the deception was breathtaking in its audacity and comprehensive planning. Creating fake medical records would require coordination with multiple accomplices and significant financial investment, suggesting that my family's efforts to obtain my inheritance had involved far more preparation and criminal intent than I had realized. The revelation that they had been working with someone who specialized in inheritance fraud indicated that this wasn't an emotional reaction to disappointment, but rather a calculated criminal enterprise. "How did you discover these activities?" I asked, needing to understand how law enforcement had become involved in what I had assumed was a private family dispute. Rebecca consulted her notes with the methodical precision that characterized all her explanations. "Thomas Brennan has been under federal investigation for mail fraud and conspiracy charges related to similar schemes involving other families. When we executed search warrants on his office and digital records, we discovered extensive communications with your parents dating back more than 2 years, along with draft documents and payment records that clearly established their participation in fraudulent activities. The timeline was particularly shocking because it meant my family had been planning to steal my inheritance since before Grandmother Eleanor's death. While I had been grieving her loss and learning to manage the responsibilities she had entrusted to me, Caroline and my parents had been actively plotting to take everything away through criminal deception. The birthday party confrontation and settlement proposal hadn't been desperate reactions to losing the cottage. They had been part of a long-term strategy to publicly establish their claims before implementing the fraudulent legal challenges. Rebecca continued presenting evidence that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of my family's activities and motivations. "The communications we've recovered show that your parents initially approached Brennan about challenging the will based on claims of undue influence. But when he explained that legitimate challenges were unlikely to succeed, they agreed to participate in creating false evidence of your grandmother's mental incapacity." The idea that my parents had been willing to attack Grandmother Eleanor's memory and reputation in pursuit of financial gain was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire revelation. She had been a woman of remarkable intelligence and clarity throughout her life, and the suggestion that she had been confused or manipulated when making inheritance decisions was not only factually wrong, but deeply disrespectful to everything she had accomplished and valued. "What specific evidence did they attempt to create?" I asked, though I dreaded hearing the details of how they had planned to dishonor both my grandmother's legacy and my own character. Rebecca extracted several documents from her file and spread them across the desk for my review. They commissioned forged medical records suggesting that your grandmother had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, fabricated witness statements claiming that you had isolated her from other family members, and created false documentation suggesting that she had expressed regret about her inheritance decisions shortly before her death. Each fabricated piece of evidence represented a calculated attack not only on my legal rights, but on my personal integrity and my relationship with Grandmother Eleanor. The forged medical records would have portrayed her as a victim of cognitive decline rather than the sharp, intentional decision-maker she had actually been. The false witness statements would have painted me as a manipulative predator who had taken advantage of an elderly relative's vulnerability. The fake documentation of regret would have suggested that she had been unhappy with her choices and wanted to change them but had been prevented from doing so by my interference. The most disturbing element, Rebecca continued, is evidence that your family was prepared to commit perjury by testifying under oath about events that never occurred and conversations that never took place. They had coordinated their stories to support the fraudulent documentation and were planning to present themselves as concerned relatives, trying to honor your grandmother's true wishes. The willingness to commit perjury demonstrated a level of criminal intent that went far beyond family greed or disappointment. They had been prepared to lie under oath in legal proceedings, risking serious criminal charges in pursuit of assets they had no legitimate claim to. The coordination required for their plan indicated extensive premeditation and careful preparation, making their actions feel even more like a betrayal of trust and family bonds. Rebecca gathered the documents back into her file and looked at me with an expression that combined professional sympathy with investigative determination. Miss Hartwell, we have enough evidence to proceed with criminal charges against all 3 family members involved in this scheme. However, as the intended victim of their fraud, your cooperation and testimony may be crucial for securing convictions that reflect the full scope of their criminal activities. The prospect of testifying against my own family members in criminal proceedings was overwhelming, even though I understood the necessity of holding them accountable for their actions. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had instead chosen to commit serious crimes in an attempt to steal my inheritance and destroy my reputation. Their willingness to attack both my grandmother's memory and my own character demonstrated a complete absence of the family loyalty they had always claimed to value so highly. What happens if they're convicted? I asked, needing to understand the potential consequences of the legal process that was apparently already underway. Rebecca explained that the charges could include mail fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and attempted theft, with potential sentences ranging from significant fines to several years in federal prison. The severity of the potential punishments reflected the serious nature of their crimes and the sophisticated planning that had gone into their scheme. But she also emphasized that successful prosecution would require demonstrating not only that they had created fraudulent documents, but that they had intended to use those documents to illegally obtain my inheritance. There's something else you should know, Rebecca said, her tone indicating that she had saved important information for the end of our conversation. Your sister Caroline has been attempting to use some of the forged documents to obtain loans against the cottage property. She's been representing herself to financial institutions as the legitimate owner and using fabricated deeds to secure credit that she has no legal right to obtain. This revelation added an entirely new dimension to the criminal enterprise my family had been operating. Caroline hadn't been content to wait for the fraudulent legal challenges to succeed. She had been actively using fake ownership documents to steal money in the present while working toward stealing the property in the future. The immediate financial fraud demonstrated an urgency and desperation that suggested she might be facing financial pressures I wasn't aware of. How much money has she obtained through these fraudulent loans? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the full scope of the damage she had attempted to cause. Rebecca consulted another section of her file before responding. She successfully obtained approximately $150,000 in secured loans using forged property deeds, and she's applied for additional credit that hasn't been processed yet. The financial institutions involved have been cooperative with our investigation once they understood that the collateral documents were fraudulent. The amount of money Caroline had stolen was substantial enough to represent serious felony charges, but it also raised questions about what she had done with those funds and whether she had the ability to repay them once the fraud was discovered. The financial institutions would undoubtedly pursue civil recovery, in addition to cooperating with criminal prosecution, creating additional legal complications that would follow her for years, even if she somehow avoided prison time. Rebecca concluded our meeting by explaining the next steps in the investigation and prosecution process. I would need to provide detailed testimony about my relationship with Grandmother Eleanor, the circumstances surrounding the inheritance, and my interactions with family members since her death. The testimony would help establish that my grandmother had been mentally competent when making her inheritance decisions, and that I had not manipulated or influenced her in any way. Most importantly, my cooperation would help ensure that the people who had attempted to steal my inheritance and destroy my reputation would face appropriate consequences for their criminal actions. The legal process would be emotionally difficult, but it would also provide official vindication of my legitimate rights and public documentation of my family's fraudulent activities. Driving back to Seattle that evening, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, sadness, and determination. The criminal investigation had revealed that my instincts about my family's manipulative behavior had been accurate, but it had also exposed depths of deception and criminal intent that exceeded my worst fears about their character and motivations. The people I had once loved and trusted had been willing to commit serious crimes, attack a deceased family member's reputation, and destroy my life in pursuit of money and property they had no right to claim. But the investigation had also provided something invaluable: official confirmation that my inheritance was legitimate, my grandmother had been competent when making her decisions, and I had done nothing wrong in accepting and managing the assets she had entrusted to my care. The criminal charges against my family would create a public record that contradicted every false narrative they had attempted to establish about my character and relationship with Grandmother Eleanor. Over the following weeks, as the investigation continued and additional evidence emerged, I began to understand that the birthday party confrontation and settlement proposal had been tactical maneuvers designed to pressure me into voluntary surrender before they implemented their fraudulent legal challenges. They had hoped that public humiliation and family pressure would convince me to share the inheritance willingly, avoiding the need to use forged documents and false testimony that carried serious criminal risks. When those pressure tactics had failed to achieve their goals, they had proceeded with their criminal scheme while simultaneously pursuing the fraudulent loans that Caroline thought would provide immediate financial benefit regardless of whether their inheritance challenge succeeded. The multi-layered approach demonstrated sophisticated planning and complete commitment to obtaining my assets through any means necessary, legal or illegal. The most painful aspect of these revelations wasn't the attempted theft itself, but the realization that my family had been willing to commit crimes and destroy relationships in pursuit of money that represented security and opportunity they could have achieved through their own efforts and choices. The inheritance that Grandmother Eleanor had intended to support my dreams and values had become the catalyst for exposing the worst aspects of people I had once cherished and respected. Daniel's support during this period of legal proceedings and emotional processing proved invaluable in ways that went far beyond friendship or business partnership. He helped me navigate the practical challenges of cooperating with federal investigators while maintaining my professional responsibilities and foundation commitments. More importantly, he provided emotional stability and perspective that allowed me to focus on moving forward rather than becoming consumed by anger and disappointment about my family's betrayal. "This investigation is giving you something precious," he observed during one of our conversations about the ongoing legal proceedings. "It's giving you absolute clarity about who these people really are and what they're capable of. That knowledge is painful, but it's also liberating because it means you can make decisions about future relationships based on truth rather than hope or obligation." His insight helped me understand that the criminal investigation, while emotionally devastating, was also providing the definitive proof I needed to end toxic family relationships with confidence and clarity. I no longer had to wonder whether I was being unfairly harsh or missing important perspectives about their motivations and character. Their willingness to commit serious crimes in pursuit of my inheritance had revealed everything I needed to know about their values and their view of our relationship. 6 months after the federal investigation began, I found myself sitting in a Portland courthouse watching my parents and Caroline face criminal charges that would fundamentally alter the rest of their lives. The media attention surrounding the case had been minimal, but the legal proceedings themselves carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire courtroom with tension and unspoken recriminations. Caroline sat at the defendant's table wearing a conservative navy suit that made her look younger and more vulnerable than I remembered from our birthday party confrontation. Her attorney, a public defender who had been assigned after her initial lawyer withdrew from the case, shuffled through papers with the weary efficiency of someone managing an unwinnable situation. My parents occupied chairs directly behind her, their faces displaying a mixture of defiance and barely concealed panic that had become their standard expression since the arrests. The federal prosecutor, a methodical woman named Sarah Patterson, presented evidence with devastating precision that left no doubt about the scope and intent of their criminal enterprise. Document after document revealed the careful planning that had gone into creating fraudulent medical records, forging property deeds, and coordinating false testimony that would have destroyed both my reputation and Grandmother Eleanor's legacy if their scheme had succeeded. When called to testify, I walked to the witness stand feeling the weight of every conversation, every family gathering, every moment of manipulation and emotional pressure that had led to this courtroom confrontation. The oath to tell the truth felt both sacred and tragic, knowing that my testimony would likely result in prison sentences for people who had once been the most important relationships in my life. Sarah Patterson guided me through questions that established the timeline of my relationship with Grandmother Eleanor, the circumstances surrounding her will, and the various attempts my family had made to pressure me into sharing the inheritance voluntarily. Each answer felt like closing a door on memories and connections that had once brought joy and comfort, even as they also provided official validation of everything I had experienced and endured. Ms. Hartwell, did your grandmother ever express any confusion or uncertainty about her inheritance decisions during your conversations with her? Sarah Patterson asked, addressing one of the central claims in the fabricated medical records. Never, I replied with absolute certainty. Grandmother Eleanor was remarkably sharp and decisive throughout our relationship. She discussed her inheritance plans with complete clarity and explained her reasoning in detail. She wanted the cottage and foundation to support sustainable energy work because she believed that was where I could make the most meaningful impact. The defense attorneys attempted to challenge my testimony by suggesting that my financial interest in maintaining the inheritance had colored my perceptions of Grandmother Eleanor's mental state. Their questions felt like personal attacks disguised as legal strategy, but I had been prepared for this approach by the federal prosecutors who had coached me on maintaining composure under hostile cross-examination. Isn't it true, Ms. Hartwell, that you spent considerable time alone with your elderly grandmother in the months before her death? Time that other family members weren't invited to share? Caroline's attorney asked, with the aggressive tone that defense lawyers use when they're trying to create doubt about witness credibility. I spent time with Grandmother Eleanor because she invited me and because we enjoyed each other's company, I answered calmly. She was interested in my work and my goals in ways that made our conversations meaningful for both of us. Other family members were always welcome to visit her, and many of them did so regularly. The cross-examination continued for nearly 2 hours, with defense attorneys attempting to portray me as a manipulative opportunist who had exploited an elderly relative's loneliness and vulnerability. Their tactics felt personally devastating, even though I understood they were performing their professional obligation to mount the strongest possible defense for their clients. But the evidence against my family was overwhelming, in ways that no amount of aggressive questioning could overcome. The forged documents had been created by professionals who left digital fingerprints that federal investigators had traced back to Thomas Brennan's criminal network. The fraudulent loans Caroline had obtained were documented through bank records that clearly showed her representations about property ownership. Most damaging of all, the recorded conversations between my parents and their co-conspirators had been preserved in digital files that revealed both the planning process and the criminal intent behind their actions. When the defense attorneys called my father to testify on his own behalf, I watched him attempt to explain away evidence that left no room for innocent interpretation. He claimed that his communications with Thomas Brennan had been preliminary discussions about legitimate legal options, but the recorded conversations clearly demonstrated his willingness to participate in creating false evidence and committing perjury to support Caroline's inheritance claims. Mr. Hartwell, were you aware that the medical records you agreed to submit as evidence of your mother's mental incapacity were completely fabricated? Sarah Patterson asked during her cross-examination. My father's hesitation before answering revealed everything about his awareness and complicity. I trusted the legal advice I was receiving, he finally replied, but his voice carried none of the conviction that had always characterized his business presentations and family pronouncements. Caroline's testimony was even more painful to witness because it revealed the depth of entitlement and resentment that had motivated her participation in the criminal scheme. She portrayed herself as a victim of my selfishness and Grandmother Eleanor's favoritism, claiming that her actions had been motivated by a desire to honor our grandmother's true wishes rather than the specific instructions contained in her legally executed will. Caroline, did you understand that using forged property deeds to obtain loans constituted fraud, regardless of whether you believed you had legitimate claims to the inheritance? Sarah Patterson asked with the relentless precision that had characterized her entire presentation. I thought I was protecting family assets until the inheritance dispute could be properly resolved, Caroline answered, but her explanation sounded rehearsed and desperate, even to my sympathetic ears. The most devastating testimony came from Thomas Brennan himself, who had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentencing on his own charges. He described in clinical detail how my family had approached him about challenging my inheritance, their willingness to pay substantial fees for fraudulent services, and their enthusiastic participation in planning criminal activities that violated both federal law and basic ethical standards. The Hartwell family was among my most committed clients, Brennan testified with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing routine business transactions. They understood that legitimate legal challenges were unlikely to succeed, and they specifically requested assistance with creating evidence that would support their preferred outcome, regardless of factual accuracy. His testimony removed any possibility that my family could claim ignorance about the criminal nature of their activities. They had knowingly and willingly participated in sophisticated fraud, with full awareness that their actions violated both legal and moral boundaries. The recorded conversations Brennan had preserved as insurance against his own legal troubles documented every stage of their criminal conspiracy. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all 3 defendants. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming evidence and the clear criminal intent that had been established through testimony and documentation. As the verdicts were read, Caroline began crying, with the desperate sobs of someone finally confronting the consequences of choices that had seemed manageable when they were just plans and possibilities. My parents received sentences of 18 months in federal prison, while Caroline's sentence included 2 years of incarceration, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The financial restitution requirements meant they would be paying for their crimes for years after completing their prison terms, assuming they could find employment despite their felony convictions. The civil lawsuits from the financial institutions Caroline had defrauded would continue long after the criminal proceedings concluded, creating additional financial burdens that would follow her indefinitely. Thomas Brennan's other victims had also filed civil suits seeking damages for the emotional distress and legal costs associated with defending against fraudulent inheritance challenges, establishing precedents that could affect my family's future financial stability. Standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing hearing, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, sadness, and relief that surprised me with its intensity. The legal system had officially validated everything I had believed about my family's criminal behavior and my own legitimate rights to Grandmother Eleanor's inheritance. But witnessing their sentencing had also provided closure to a chapter of my life that had been defined by confusion, manipulation, and emotional turmoil. Daniel met me at the courthouse steps, providing the kind of steady support that had become invaluable throughout the legal proceedings and emotional challenges of the past year. His presence reminded me that while I had lost the family relationships that had once seemed essential to my identity, I had also gained clarity about the kind of people I wanted to surround myself with going forward. "How are you feeling?" he asked as we walked toward his car, his voice carrying the gentle concern that characterized all his approaches to discussing difficult emotions. "Free," I answered, surprising myself with the immediate certainty of my response. For the first time since Grandmother Eleanor died, I feel completely free to use her gifts according to her intentions, without worrying about family pressure or legal challenges. The criminal convictions had eliminated any remaining uncertainty about my ownership rights and provided official documentation that contradicted every false narrative my family had attempted to establish about my character and relationship with Grandmother Eleanor. More importantly, they had freed me from the emotional obligation to maintain relationships with people who had proven themselves capable of extraordinary deception and betrayal. Over the following months, as my family began serving their prison sentences, I found myself experiencing a peace and focus that had been missing throughout my adult life. The foundation work expanded significantly, with new programs supporting women in renewable energy careers, and innovative research projects at universities across the Pacific Northwest. The cottage became both a personal retreat and a conference center, where I hosted gatherings for environmental entrepreneurs and sustainable technology developers. Hartwell Sustainable Solutions grew into a regional leader in community-based renewable energy installations, with contracts spanning from California to Alaska. The success felt particularly meaningful because it validated Grandmother Eleanor's belief that I would use her inheritance to create positive change rather than simply enjoying personal luxury or financial security. Most surprisingly, the end of my toxic family relationships had created space for healthier connections to develop and flourish. Daniel and I had transitioned from business partners to life partners, building a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine understanding of each other's goals and dreams. His family welcomed me with the kind of authentic warmth I had always hoped to experience, but had never found within my own family dynamics. I also developed closer relationships with colleagues, foundation beneficiaries, and community members who appreciated my work and character without requiring me to diminish myself to accommodate their insecurities or entitlement. These connections provided the emotional support and intellectual stimulation that healthy relationships should offer, reminding me of what I had been missing during years of trying to maintain peace with people who viewed my success as a threat to their own self-image. 1 year after the criminal convictions, I received a letter from Caroline written from the federal correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. The letter contained what appeared to be an apology for her actions and an expression of regret about the damage our family conflict had caused to our relationship. But reading between the lines, I could detect the same manipulative undertones that had characterized our interactions throughout our adult lives. She claimed that her criminal actions had been motivated by love for our family and concern about preserving Grandmother Eleanor's legacy, rather than acknowledging the greed and entitlement that had actually driven her behavior. She suggested that we might be able to rebuild our relationship after her release if I could find it in my heart to forgive the mistakes she had made during a difficult period in her life. The letter revealed that even imprisonment and criminal conviction hadn't fundamentally changed Caroline's perspective on our conflict, or her own responsibility for the choices that had led to her current circumstances. She continued to view herself as a victim of unfair treatment, rather than as someone who had made deliberate decisions to commit serious crimes in pursuit of assets she had no legitimate claim to. I wrote a brief response acknowledging receipt of her letter but declining to engage in the kind of extended correspondence she seemed to be requesting. My new life was built on authentic relationships and clear boundaries, and I had no interest in recreating the exhausting emotional dynamics that had defined our family interactions for so many years. Daniel and I were married in a small ceremony at the cottage, surrounded by friends and colleagues who celebrated our commitment with genuine joy and enthusiasm. The wedding felt like a perfect expression of how Grandmother Eleanor had envisioned me using her gift, creating meaningful moments and lasting memories in a place that represented both natural beauty and personal freedom. As we exchanged vows on the beach where Grandmother Eleanor had once walked and shared her wisdom about following my dreams despite other people's limitations, I felt her presence and approval in ways that connected me to her legacy more powerfully than any family tradition or inherited obligation ever could have. The Foundation's work continued, expanding into new areas of sustainable technology and environmental education, supporting innovations that promise to address climate change challenges while creating economic opportunities for underserved communities. Each project felt like honoring both Grandmother Eleanor's vision and my own commitment to using privilege and resources for positive change rather than personal comfort. 3 years after the criminal trials, I learned through mutual acquaintances that my parents had been released from prison and were attempting to rebuild their lives with limited success. The felony convictions had made employment difficult, and the civil judgments against them continued to affect their financial stability. Caroline still had 1 year remaining on her prison sentence, followed by the supervised probation that would restrict her activities and require regular reporting to federal authorities. The information about their circumstances didn't generate the emotional response I might have expected during the earlier stages of our conflict. I felt neither satisfaction about their ongoing struggles nor guilt about my own success and happiness. They had made choices that led to predictable consequences, and those consequences belonged to them in the same way that the inheritance and its opportunities belonged to me. The cottage had become exactly what Grandmother Eleanor had envisioned when she chose to leave it specifically to me. It served as headquarters for foundation activities, retreat space for renewable energy conferences, and personal sanctuary, where Daniel and I could recharge from the demands of running a growing business. The property's natural beauty provided daily reminders of the values that guided our work and the importance of protecting environmental resources for future generations. Standing on the cottage deck one evening, watching the Pacific sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed too vibrant to be real, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that devastating birthday party to this moment of genuine contentment and purpose. The path had required courage I hadn't known I possessed, boundaries I had never learned to establish, and faith in my own judgment that had been tested through months of family pressure and legal uncertainty. But the journey had also led to discoveries about my own strength, clarity about my values, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. Grandmother Eleanor's inheritance had provided far more than financial security or beautiful property. It had given me the freedom to become the person she had always believed I could be, uncompromised by other people's expectations or limitations. The Foundation's latest annual report documented impact that exceeded even my most ambitious initial goals, with renewable energy installations serving thousands of families and educational programs supporting hundreds of women pursuing careers in sustainable technology. The work felt like a perfect expression of how personal healing and social change could reinforce each other when approached with intention and integrity. Daniel joined me on the deck, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression that characterized his approach to our shared life and work. "The proposal from the University of Washington came through," he said, referring to a partnership that would expand our research programs into advanced battery technology for renewable energy storage. The news represented another milestone in our mission to make sustainable energy accessible and affordable for communities that had been overlooked by larger corporations focused primarily on profit rather than environmental impact. Each new project validated Grandmother Eleanor's belief that the inheritance would enable work that mattered beyond personal success or family satisfaction. As darkness settled over the Pacific Ocean and stars became visible in the clear coastal sky, I felt grateful for the difficult journey that had led to this peaceful evening and this meaningful work. The family relationships I had lost through their criminal betrayal had been replaced by connections based on shared values and mutual respect. The inheritance that had once seemed like a burden laden with impossible expectations had become the foundation for creating positive change in exactly the ways Grandmother Eleanor had envisioned. The cottage would continue serving as both sanctuary and workspace, supporting the kind of innovation and community impact that honored both environmental stewardship and social responsibility. The Foundation would keep expanding its reach and effectiveness, providing opportunities for people who shared my commitment to sustainable technology and environmental justice. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment and establish boundaries that protected both my well-being and my ability to pursue meaningful work, without interference from people who couldn't support my success or respect my autonomy. The painful lessons about family loyalty and personal integrity had ultimately led to freedom that felt more valuable than any inheritance, no matter how generous or life-changing it might have been. The waves continued their eternal rhythm against the rocky shoreline, creating a soundtrack that connected this moment to all the evenings Grandmother Eleanor had spent walking this same beach and dreaming about the possibilities her inheritance might create. Her vision had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations, proving that trusting someone's potential rather than limiting their options could create ripple effects that extended far beyond individual success to encompass community impact and environmental healing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.